Good evening, and welcome back to the Somnorian. Settle in wherever you are, dim the lights, let your shoulders drop, and let the rest of the day fall away. Tonight we're wandering into the strange and earnest world of medieval love, where the people handing out romantic advice were, more often than not, the least qualified people in Christendom to give it. If you enjoy these quiet trips into the past, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps the channel, only if you mean it. And I always love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Leave it below. Now let's begin with the man who wrote the rulebook. Sometime around the year 1185, a writer named Andreas Capellanus sat down and produced a book called De Amor, on love. We usually translate it as the art of courtly love, and for centuries it was treated as the closest thing the Middle Ages had to a dating manual. The word Capellanus isn't really a surname, it means the chaplain. So the single most influential text on how to woo a woman in medieval Europe was written by a man whose actual job title was more or less priest. We don't know an enormous amount about him. He seems to have been attached to the royal court of France, possibly in the circle of Marie de Champagne, the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And we'll get to those two remarkable women later, because they matter a great deal to this story. What we can say is that Andreas was a churchman, writing for aristocrats, laying out in careful detail how a nobleman should pursue, win, and keep the love of a lady. And the entire framework he built rested on one quietly astonishing assumption, that the truest, purest form of love was almost always adulterous, and almost never something you'd find in your own marriage. A priest wrote that, on purpose, with chapter headings. To understand why a man of the church was writing this at all, you have to understand who could actually read and write in the 12th century. Literacy in medieval Europe was overwhelmingly concentrated in the clergy. If a book existed, odds were good that a monk, a canon, or a chaplain had written it, copied it, and shelved it. The Latin word for a member of the clergy, clericus, is the root of our word clerk, precisely because the clergy were the ones who did the reading, the writing, and the record-keeping. So when the aristocracy of France developed a fashionable new obsession with refined, elegant, agonized romantic love, the people equipped to actually write it all down were the exact same people who had taken vows never to experience it. This is the first great irony of medieval love literature, and it runs through everything. The experts were amateurs. Andreas describes the stages of a love affair, the meeting, the hope, the trembling, the granting of favour, with the confident precision of a man explaining a card game he has only ever watched other people play. And to be fair to him, watching was exactly what a court chaplain did. He lived among these people. He saw the glances across the hall and heard the gossip and probably took confession from half the participants. He had, in a sense, excellent field notes. He just wasn't allowed to run the experiment himself. Andreas structured the book in a way that would look familiar to anyone who has read a modern self-help title. The first part defines what love is and who is capable of it. The second explains how to keep love once you have it, and how it can be lost. And then there's a third part, which we'll come back to, where he takes it all back. But the heart of the book, the part everyone remembers, is a set of model dialogues, scripts essentially, showing a man of one social rank trying to talk a woman of another social rank into loving him, a commoner speaking to a noblewoman, a nobleman speaking to a woman of the higher nobility, every possible pairing, with the correct lines written out. It is, in the most literal sense, a book of pick-up routines from the 12th century, drafted by a priest, organised by class. And the routines are magnificent. The men in these dialogues argue their case like lawyers. They cite the ennobling power of love, insist that devotion will make them better and braver men, and counter every objection the lady raises with another polished paragraph. The women, it must be said, are frequently the smarter party. They push back, they poke holes, they point out flattery for what it is. Andreas clearly enjoyed writing the women's rebuttals, but the whole exercise assumes that love is something you win through superior argument, as though the way to a woman's heart is to simply out-debate her until she concedes the point. It's romance as moot court. Buried in the middle of all this, Andreas gives us the part that made the book famous for the next 800 years, a numbered list of the rules of love. There are 31 of them. He frames them wonderfully as having been discovered on a scroll delivered by the King of Love himself, carried out of a magical Arthurian otherworld by a knight who passed a series of trials to retrieve them. so the rules don't just arrive as one man's opinion. They arrive with a fantasy backstory, like the terms and conditions were handed down by a fairy tale monarch. This was Andreas's way of giving his advice authority, and honestly, inventing a mythical king to endorse your dating tips is a bold branding move for a chaplain. The rules themselves are where the whole thing tips from quaint into deeply strange, because so many of them describe love not as a joy but as a medical emergency. Rule 2 states plainly that a person who is not jealous cannot love. Jealousy isn't a flaw in this system, it's the proof. Another rule holds that real love is always growing or shrinking and can never simply sit still and be content. Love at rest, to Andreas, is love already dying. He tells us that a lover goes pale at the sight of the beloved, that the true lover eats little and sleeps little, that the heart pounds and the body wastes. And he means all of this as description of the ideal, not as a warning. The healthier and calmer your relationship, the less real your love, by this accounting. It's a philosophy of romance in which the appropriate response to seeing the person you adore is to lose your appetite and possibly faint. One rule in particular gets quoted more than any other, and it's the load-bearing wall of the entire book. Love can have no place between people who are married to each other. Andreas states it directly. Marriage and love are simply different things in his framework because he defines love as something freely given, secret and constantly at risk, and marriage is a public duty, an arrangement of property and family, granted by obligation rather than freely won. If your wife has to love you, the reasoning goes, then it isn't really love at all. You can only truly love someone who is under no obligation to love you back, which is a genuinely interesting idea, and also a catastrophic one to build a household on, and it was written by a man who was never going to have a household to worry about. It helps to remember what marriage actually was for the aristocracy Andreas was writing for. Among the nobility, marriage was a treaty. You married to bind two families, to secure land, to produce a legitimate heir who would inherit that land, and to keep alliances from fraying. Affection was, at best, a happy accident that might turn up later. The people getting married often had little say in the matter, and sometimes met their spouse only shortly before the wedding. In a world like that, it made a certain grim sense to conclude that if you wanted actual passion, the trembling, the pining, the choosing, you'd have to look somewhere other than the marriage your parents arranged for you before you could grow a beard. Andreas didn't invent that gap between duty and desire. He just wrote it down and gave it 31 rules. Now, Andreas Capellanus was not working alone in a vacuum, and this is where the story widens out. He was writing down and organising a set of ideas that had been floating through the courts of southern France and beyond for a couple of generations already, carried mostly in song by the troubadours, the poet-musicians who had turned longing into an art form and frankly a career. We'll spend a whole chapter with them later because they deserve it. For now, the point is that Andreas was the systematizer. He took a diffuse, musical, emotional culture of yearning and did the most churchman thing imaginable to it. He made it into a syllabus. He gave it definitions, categories, numbered rules, and worked examples. He turned a feeling into a curriculum. And the influence of that curriculum is hard to overstate. De Amour survived in dozens of manuscripts. It was copied, translated, argued over, and quoted across Europe for centuries. It shaped how poets wrote, how stories were told, and how educated people talked about love, right through the age of Chaucer and beyond. Chaucer knew these ideas intimately, and you can feel Andreas hovering behind the great medieval love stories that came after. A book of advice from one 12th century chaplain became part of the operating system of European romance. Somewhere out there, a man who never married quietly wrote the rules that would govern how the whole continent daydreamed about love. Which brings us to the twist, and it's a good one. That third part of the book I mentioned, the final section, is where Andreas turns around and tells you to ignore everything he just said. Having spent the bulk of De Amour teaching men how to pursue love, he closes with a lengthy passage rejecting love altogether. Worldly love, he now explains, is a snare. It ruins your health, empties your purse, offends God, and reduces a man to a servant of his passions. He lists the miseries love causes and urges the reader to turn away from women and toward heaven instead. So the great medieval manual on how to fall in love ends with a firm chapter on why you absolutely should not. Scholars have argued for a very long time about what Andreas was actually doing here. Some read the whole book as sincere and the reversal as a genuine spasm of religious conscience. a man who wrote a fun, worldly book and then panicked about his soul in the final act. Others read it as clever satire, the ending being the real point, with the earlier chapters written to be knocked down. Others think it was designed as a kind of moral exercise, showing the reader both the seductive path and its consequences so they could choose the higher one with eyes open. The honest answer is that we don't fully know. Andreas left the room without explaining himself, and 8 centuries of readers have been arguing about the last chapter ever since. But whatever he intended, the shape of the thing is perfect, and it tells you almost everything about medieval attitudes toward love in a single gesture. Here is a priest, sworn to celibacy, writing the most detailed guide to romantic pursuit his century produced. Dialogues, rules, a fairy tale king, class-by-class scripts for seduction, and then, at the very end, snapping the book shut and insisting that the wise man wants none of it. Desire and denial packed into the same volume by the same hand with no resolution offered. That tension isn't a flaw in the medieval understanding of love. It practically is the medieval understanding of love. And Andreas was far from the only celibate man laying down the law about desire. The entire medieval framework for who you could marry, when you could sleep with them, what was permitted and what was sin, and what you owed to God in the whole business. All of that was built, argued, and enforced by monks and canon lawyers and theologians who had by definition renounced the thing they were legislating. The people who wrote the rules of medieval love, from the courtly poet's chaplain to the church courts that could dissolve a marriage, were overwhelmingly men who had promised never to marry. They studied desire the way an astronomer studies a distant star, carefully, seriously, at a permanent and unbridgeable distance. Next time you catch yourself reading dating advice from someone who seems suspiciously certain about it, spare a thought for Andreas. He'd understand completely. He wrote the original. Chapter 2. Love is a sickness. And that's the good news. If you've ever told a friend you were sick with love and meant it as a figure of speech, a medieval physician would have taken you at your word, sat you down, checked your pulse, examined your urine, and written you a prescription. Because in the medieval world, lovesickness was not a metaphor. It was a diagnosable medical condition with a Latin name, a recognized set of symptoms, a place in the standard textbooks, and treatments that ran from the sensible to the genuinely alarming. The man pining hopelessly for a woman across the great hall was not, in the eyes of a trained doctor, being romantic. He was ill, and it was the doctor's job to cure him. The condition had a name, and in fact several. The most common was amor heroios, sometimes written amor heroicus, heroic love, or the love of heroes and lords, because it was thought to strike the noble and the idle most severely. The term is a beautiful little linguistic accident. It seems to blend the Greek word eros with the Latin herus, meaning a lord or master, and possibly with the notion of the ancient heroes, so that the very name of the disease can't decide whether it's about erotic desire, aristocratic leisure, or heroic suffering. Medieval doctors used it anyway, with total confidence, the way we throw around a diagnosis we half understand because it sounds official. To see why they treated it as a real disease, you have to step into the medical model they were working with, which came down to them from the ancient Greeks and had been elaborated for over 1,000 years. Medieval medicine was built on the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, the 4 fluids thought to govern the body and the temperament. Health was balance among them, illness was imbalance, and the humour blamed for lovesickness was black bile, melancholia, the cold, dry fluid associated with sorrow, obsession, and fixation. Love in this scheme was not located in some poetic heart. It was a disorder of black bile that dried out the body and fixed the mind on a single object, and it belonged in the same medical neighbourhood as what we would now call depression. The mechanism they proposed is oddly specific and, in its own logic, almost sophisticated. When a man saw a beautiful woman, the theory went, her image entered through his eyes and lodged in the brain, in one of the ventricles thought to house the faculty of estimation and imagination. There the image stuck. It became an obsession the mind could not release, and the constant dwelling on it dried and cooled the body, deepening the melancholy, which in turn made the obsession worse, in a self-feeding loop. So the medieval doctor understood lovesickness as a kind of malfunction of the imagination, a stuck image, burned into the mind, throwing the whole system out of balance. They were describing intrusive, obsessive thought with the vocabulary they had, and they weren't entirely wrong about the experience, only about the plumbing. The symptoms they listed read like a checklist any heartbroken teenager would recognize. The lovesick patient grew pale and thin because he wasn't eating. He couldn't sleep. His eyes were hollow and sunken, and he wept for no reason his companions could see. His pulse was erratic, and here the doctors made a genuinely clever observation, noting that the lovesick pulse would jump and race specifically when the beloved's name was spoken or the person came near, and settle again when the subject changed. There's a famous ancient story, retold throughout the Middle Ages, of a physician diagnosing a lovesick prince exactly this way. Watching the young man's pulse leap at the entrance of one particular woman and correctly deducing who the patient was secretly in love with. Medieval doctors treated that trick as a legitimate diagnostic tool. Take the pulse, run through the names and watch for the flutter. Heartbreak detection by manual measurement. Beyond the pulse, the physicians catalogued the mood with real care. The patient was listless and lost interest in everything except the one person. He swung between elation and despair. He sighed constantly. He sought out solitude and dark places, and he would sit fixated, staring at nothing, replaying the beloved's image in his dried-out brain. One influential description held that if you left the condition untreated, it could deepen into full melancholic madness, and from there the patient might waste away entirely and die. Lovesickness, in the medieval understanding, was not a mild ailment you'd shrug off. Left alone, it was potentially fatal, which meant a doctor was fully justified in treating it as an emergency. The most influential single source for all of this was not a European at all. He was a Persian physician named Abu Bakr al-Razi, known in the Latin West as Rhazes, and even more importantly Ibn Sina, whom Europe call Avicenna, whose vast medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, became the backbone of medical teaching in European universities for centuries. Avicenna discussed lovesickness, in Arabic, ishq, as a real disorder, described the wasting and the obsessive fixation, and recorded the pulse and name diagnostic method. When medieval European doctors treated heartbreak as a disease, they were following the most respected medical authority they had, translated out of Arabic, itself drawing on Greek foundations. The idea travelled from ancient Greece, through the great physicians of the Islamic world, into the Latin universities of Europe, gathering detail at every stop. This was mainstream, textbook medicine, not fringe folklore. So what did they actually do about it? This is where the cure gets interesting, because the treatment split into two very different camps, and both were prescribed by serious men in complete earnest. The first camp was gentle and, frankly, humane. Since the disease came from a dried, cooled, melancholic body fixated on a single image, the remedy was to warm the body back up, restore its moisture, and pull the mind off its obsession. So the physicians prescribed good food, rich, moist, nourishing meals to rebuild the wasted body. They prescribed wine in moderation to warm the blood and lift the spirits. They prescribed baths, especially warm and pleasant ones, to restore moisture and calm the nerves. They prescribed sleep, which the patient desperately needed. They prescribed music and cheerful company and beautiful gardens and long conversations with friends and travel to new places where fresh sights would crowd out the stuck image. Stripped of the humoral theory, a good chunk of the medieval prescription for heartbreak amounts to eat well, drink a little wine, take a warm bath, get some sleep, see your friends, and go somewhere new. Which is more or less exactly what a kind person would tell a heartbroken friend today. They also prescribed distraction in more pointed forms. One recommendation was to occupy the patient with business and responsibility, to keep the mind too busy to brood. Another, which turns up repeatedly, was to have wise older people talk the young man out of it, to reason with him, to point out the beloved's flaws, to argue him down from his fixation. There was an entire recognized therapeutic method of sitting the lovesick patient down and essentially running him through the reasons his crush was not worth dying over. The medieval physician, in this mode, was part doctor and part exasperated friend delivering a very long she's not all that speech, with the full authority of the medical profession behind it. And then there was the second camp, which is where things take a sharp turn, because the boldest and most notorious cure prescribed by these same respected authorities was, simply, sex. If the disease was caused by unfulfilled desire fixating the mind, then the most direct cure was to fulfill it and break the fixation. Some physicians recommended, plainly, that the patient sleep with the object of his love, on the reasoning that consummation would release the built-up desire and dissolve the obsession. Others, aware that this was often impossible, the beloved might be married or of the wrong rank or entirely unwilling, recommended that the patient sleep with someone else, more or less anyone else, to drain the excess and reset the system. Intercourse was understood to expel excess humours and relieve the body, and so it was prescribed the way we might prescribe rest or fluids, as a straightforward physical remedy, coolly in the medical texts. Some of the surviving advice on this point is startlingly blunt. Certain authorities suggested that a large number of encounters with many different partners was the surest way to dislodge a stubborn fixation, on the theory that variety would prevent a new obsession from forming and scatter the mind's attachment. So you could, in principle, walk into a medieval physician's presence heartbroken over one unattainable woman, and walk out with a prescription to go and sleep with as many other people as it took to forget her, signed off in effect by the medical establishment. It is one of the few moments in the history of medicine where the treatment sounds less like a cure and more like the beginning of an entirely new set of problems. Not everyone was comfortable with this, and here the tension we saw in the last chapter returns, because much of medieval medicine was taught and practiced by clergy, or at least by men writing within a deeply Christian culture. Prescribing casual sex as a therapy sat very badly against church teaching, which held sex outside marriage to be sin. So you get the fascinating spectacle of medical writers acknowledging that intercourse was, medically speaking, the most effective cure, while adding careful notes that of course it must only be with one's lawful spouse, or hedging that they mention the remedy only because their authorities did, or quietly recommending the gentler cures, the baths, the wine, the travel, the talking to, as the respectable path. The doctor's body of knowledge and the priest's body of rules were in open disagreement, and the medieval physician had to stand with one foot in each, prescribing a cure his own culture told him was a sin. There were also darker corners to the treatment. Because lovesickness was classed alongside melancholic disorders, some of the harsher remedies for melancholy could be turned on it, including bloodletting to draw off the corrupt black bile directly, and purging to clear the system. A severely lovesick patient might therefore be bled or dosed with purgatives in an effort to physically remove the offending humour from the body. There's something bleakly comic in it. A young man, wasting and sleepless over a woman he can't have, being told the solution is to open a vein and let some of the heart break out. But within the humoral logic it was perfectly consistent. If the trouble was too much black bile, you reduced the black bile, and a lancet was one way to do it. What ties all of this together, the pulse reading, the warm baths, the stern talking to, the wine, the bloodletting, the frankly reckless prescriptions for promiscuity, is that medieval people took the pain of love completely seriously as a real thing happening in a real body. They did not treat heartbreak as a weakness to be mocked or a mood to be ignored. They gave it a name, a place in the greatest medical textbooks of the age, a set of symptoms a physician could check, and a course of treatment as considered as anything they'd offer for a fever. A lovesick nobleman could summon a doctor to his bedside with as much legitimacy as a man with a broken leg, and that doctor would arrive, take the racing pulse, note the sunken eyes and the wasted frame, and set about curing him. And there's something quietly moving underneath the strangeness of it. Peel away the four humours and the sunken eye diagnostics and the alarming prescriptions, and what the medieval physician was really doing was validating the sufferer, telling a person crushed by longing that what they felt was real, that it had a name, that it could be understood, and that it could, in time and with care, be healed. The specifics were often wrong. The impulse was remarkably kind. They looked at a heartbroken young man, refused to tell him to simply get over it, and instead said, "You are ill, this is a known illness, and here is what we can do." For all the bloodletting, that's a gentler response to heartbreak than a lot of what gets offered now. Chapter 3. The Courts of Love. Picture a hall in southern France in the late 12th century, hung with tapestries, warmed by a fire and filled with noblewomen who have gathered not to sew or to gossip but to hold court. A real court with a plaintiff, a defendant, arguments, a deliberation and a binding verdict. Except the case before them isn't a land dispute or a theft. The question up for judgment is whether a knight who has been dismissed by his lady should be allowed to return to her, or whether true love can survive a marriage, or which of two suitors a woman ought to favour. According to the sources, these tribunals existed. They were presided over by the most powerful women of the age, and they ruled on affairs of the heart with the gravity of a bench handing down law. Whether they were quite as real as the sources claim is a question we'll have to sit with, but let's meet the women first, because they were entirely real and remarkable. At the centre of it stands Eleanor of Aquitaine, who has a fair claim to being the most extraordinary woman of the entire Middle Ages. Born around 1122, she inherited the vast wealthy duchy of Aquitaine in southern France as a teenager, which made her one of the richest and most desirable heiresses in Europe before she was old enough to run it. She married the King of France, Louis VII, becoming Queen of France. She went with him on the Second Crusade, actually travelling to the Holy Land, which was scandalous and unusual for a queen. That marriage was eventually annulled, and here's a small dark comedy of medieval royal life. After 15 years and 2 daughters, it was dissolved partly on the grounds that Louis and Eleanor were too closely related by blood, a technicality that had been perfectly visible the entire time and became useful only once the marriage had soured. What Eleanor did next is the part that leaves you blinking. Just 8 weeks after her marriage to the King of France ended, she married Henry, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who was about 11 years younger than her. 2 years after that, Henry became King Henry II of England. So Eleanor of Aquitaine managed to be Queen of France and then Queen of England in a single lifetime by marrying 2 different kings. She bore Henry a large brood of children, including 2 future kings of England, Richard the Lionheart and John, the one who ended up signing Magna Carta. She later helped her sons rebel against their own father, was caught, and was kept under house arrest by Henry for roughly 16 years. She outlived him, was released, and remained a formidable political force into her 80s. This is the woman said to have presided over the courts of love, and once you know her biography, the idea that she'd convene a tribunal to rule on romantic etiquette seems entirely in character. The other central figure is Eleanor's daughter, not by Henry, but by her first husband, the King of France. Her name was Marie, and she became the Countess of Champagne, a great territory in northeastern France with a brilliant court of its own. Marie de Champagne was a genuine literary patron, and this is where the threads of our whole story start to pull together, because Marie was the patron of the poet Chrétien de Troyes, one of the most important writers of medieval romance, the man who gave us early and hugely influential versions of the King Arthur legends and the affair of Lancelot and Guinevere. And Marie is also the woman to whom our chaplain from Chapter 1, Andreas Capellanus, was attached, the court where he wrote, and quite possibly the person who set him the task. The rules of love, the Arthurian romances, and the courts of love all cluster around this one remarkable mother and daughter. So where does the idea of the courts of love actually come from? Overwhelmingly from Andreas himself. In De Amore, alongside the rules and the model dialogues, Andreas records what he presents as actual judgments handed down in real disputes, and he names the judges. He attributes specific verdicts to Eleanor, to Marie de Champagne, to Ermengarde, the Viscountess of Narbonne, and to other high-ranking noblewomen. He frames them as authorities whose rulings on love settle the matter, the way you'd cite a judge's decision as precedent. Reading it, you get the strong impression of an established institution. Bring your romantic dispute before these great ladies, lay out the facts, and receive a ruling. And the cases he records are genuinely delightful, because they take the strange premises of courtly love and apply them as if they were points of law to be reasoned through. The single most famous judgment attributed to Marie de Champagne tackles the question that Andreas's whole system rests on. Can true love exist between a married couple? Marie's ruling, as Andreas reports it, is a firm no. Her reasoning follows directly from the courtly definition of love, that real love is freely given between people under no obligation, whereas married people are bound by duty to each other, so what passes between spouses cannot be love in the true sense. She reportedly added that lovers give each other everything freely and without the compulsion of any necessity, while married partners are duty-bound to submit to each other's wishes. A countess, in other words, is recorded issuing an official verdict that love and marriage are fundamentally incompatible, and doing it with the calm authority of a judge citing settled law. Another case in Andreas takes up a wonderfully thorny problem. A woman had a lover, and it was agreed that if the two of them should ever marry, the love between them would necessarily end, because of course, love cannot survive marriage. Later the couple did marry each other. The woman then argued that since love had by definition ended with the wedding, she was now free to take a new lover. Her former lover, now her husband, objected. The dispute went before Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, and Eleanor's judgment is a small masterpiece of navigating an impossible system. She affirmed the principle that love cannot exist between spouses, which put the wife in a genuinely awkward position, since the logic of her own court had trapped everyone in a paradox. The Queen upheld the letter of the courtly law even where it led somewhere absurd, which is either excellent jurisprudence or an elaborate joke, and it's often hard to tell which. There are more. One judgment addresses whether a man loses his claim to a lady if he goes off, marries someone else, and then comes back wanting to resume the old affair. Another weighs whether love is better spent on a young man or an old one. Another handles the delicate matter of a lover who has been granted every favour, and then finds the lady growing cold. In each, the noble women deliberate and rule, and the rulings are recorded as if they carried real weight. Taken together, they paint a picture of an entire alternative legal system, a body of case law governing the heart, administered by women, running in parallel to the actual law of the land that was administered almost entirely by men. And that picture is intoxicating, which is exactly why we have to slow down and ask the awkward question, did any of this actually happen? Here the honest answer disappoints the romantic in all of us, because most modern historians are deeply sceptical that the courts of love were real institutions in the way Andreas presents them. There are good reasons for the doubt. The judgments survive almost entirely in Andreas's book, and a few closely related texts, rather than in the kind of independent records, charters, letters, chronicles, that document real medieval legal proceedings. The women he names were real and powerful, but there's little outside evidence that they convened to rule on love cases, and Andreas, as we saw, was a writer perfectly capable of inventing a fairy tale king of love to lend his rules authority, so attributing witty verdicts to famous living noblewomen fits his method exactly. The likeliest explanation, and the one many scholars favour, is that the courts of love were a literary game, a sophisticated entertainment played at real courts, dressed up in the language of law. Picture the actual court of Marie de Champagne on a winter evening, cultured, clever, bored in the way that only the very comfortable can be, and delighted by wit. Someone poses a romantic dilemma. The company debates it, taking sides, making arguments, and eventually a great lady delivers a mock verdict, half in jest and half in earnest, and everyone applauds the cleverness of it. It's part parlour game, part debate club, part performance. And Andreas, writing it all down, simply recorded these entertainments in the formal language of judgment, whether because that was the conceit of the game, or because it made a better book. That reading takes nothing away from how interesting the whole thing is. If anything, it makes it richer. Because even as a game, the courts of love tell us something real about these particular courts and these particular women. They tell us that in the cultivated aristocratic circles of 12th century France, love was treated as a serious subject worthy of sustained intellectual argument, something to be debated with the same energy other people brought to theology or law. They tell us that women like Eleanor and Marie presided over a genuine culture of wit and refinement, where a sharp verdict on a romantic puzzle was a form of social power. And they tell us that the strange rules of courtly love weren't just written in books and left there. They were played with, argued over, and turned into a kind of sport by the people at the top of society. It's worth pausing on how unusual it is to find women in the judge's seat at all, even a pretend one. Medieval public life was overwhelmingly male. Law, government, the church, the university, the formal institutions of power were closed to women almost entirely. So the courts of love, real or literary, carve out a striking little space in which women are the authorities. Women's judgment settles the question, and men come as petitioners to hear a woman's ruling. In a world where a woman's legal identity was often folded into her husband's or her father's, the fantasy, or the game, of a tribunal where great ladies hand down binding decisions has a real charge to it. Whether or not Eleanor ever literally convened a bench, the culture that imagined her doing so was imagining something quietly radical. There's also a lovely irony in the specific verdict that keeps recurring, the ruling that love cannot exist within marriage. These judgments were being handed down, in the story at least, by women whose own marriages were high political arrangements. Eleanor married to 2 kings in succession for reasons of power and dynasty. Her daughter Marie married into Champagne. When Eleanor of Aquitaine is depicted ruling that real love lives outside marriage, it's being said by a woman whose marriages were treaties, who understood better than almost anyone alive that a royal wedding was about crowns and territory rather than trembling hearts. The verdict reads differently when you remember who's supposed to be delivering it. It's not naive romanticism. It's the hard-earned realism of women who knew exactly what marriage was for, and it wasn't for love. Whatever the courts of love actually were, solemn institution, elaborate parlour game, or a bit of both, blurred by an author with a taste for invention, they leave us with an image that's hard to shake. A fire, a hall in Aquitaine or Champagne, a circle of the most powerful women in Europe, and a serious debate underway about the rules of the human heart, ending in a verdict delivered with a straight face. Somewhere between history and literature, Eleanor and her daughter presided over a world that took love seriously enough to put it on trial, and they sat as the judges. Chapter 4. How to flirt without getting anyone killed. Here is the problem at the heart of courtly love, the practical difficulty that all the poetry and all the rules were built to solve. The whole system was designed for people who were, in most cases, not free to act on any of it. The lady a knight adored was very often married, frequently to his own lord, the man who fed him, armed him, and could have him killed on a whim. The desire was supposed to be intense, all-consuming, the stuff of sleepless nights and racing pulses, and it also had to be, at every moment, deniable. So an entire elaborate code grew up around a single impossible task: how to communicate overwhelming love to someone across a crowded hall without a single word or gesture that could be used as evidence against you. Medieval flirtation was, in large part, the art of saying everything while being able to prove you said nothing. Start with the eyes, because everyone agreed the eyes were where love began. We saw in the last chapter that the physicians thought love literally entered through the eyes as an image that lodged in the brain, and the poets thought so too. The gaze was the opening move. A look held a beat too long across the hall, then broken, then risked again. This is why the literature is so obsessed with glances, with stolen looks and lowered eyes, and the electric moment when two people's eyes meet, and both know. In a setting where you could not walk over and speak, the eyes did the entire early work of courtship, and a whole vocabulary grew up around them. The bold look, the shy look, the look that lingers, the look quickly pulled away when someone else glances over. It was flirtation conducted entirely in the one medium that leaves no record, and it worked precisely because a look can always be denied. But a look could only carry you so far, and here the medieval lover ran into the central obstacle of aristocratic life, which was that you were essentially never alone. The great hall, the solar, the garden, the chapel. These were shared, populated, watched spaces, full of servants, relatives, retainers, and other members of the household who had nothing better to do than notice things. Privacy as we understand it barely existed. A noblewoman was surrounded by attendants through most of her waking life, and a private conversation between a man and a woman who were not married was itself suspicious. So every method of courtship had to work in public, under observation, in plain sight of people actively looking for exactly this kind of thing, which is why so much of it became a code. The most important figure in this whole watched world was one we should name directly, because the medieval sources are obsessed with him. The locengier, the slanderer, the gossip, the talebearer. In troubadour poetry, the locengiers are the villains, the enemies of all lovers, the flatterers and spies at court who watch for signs of a secret love, and then carry the tale to the husband, or spread it for their own advantage, purely out of envy or malice. The lover's great fear was not the beloved's coldness, but the lozengier's sharp eye. A huge amount of courtly technique was designed specifically to defeat these watchers, to conduct an affair, or even just a longing, right under their noses without giving them anything solid to report. When you read the poets railing against the lozengiers, you're hearing the real anxiety underneath the romance, that in a world with no privacy, the deadliest thing at court was a person who paid attention. This is where secrecy stops being a mood and becomes a formal rule of the game. Concealment wasn't just prudent, it was considered part of what made love noble. Andreas Capellanus lists it among his rules: love that is made public rarely lasts. The secrecy was woven into the ethics of the thing, so that a lover who couldn't keep the secret, who bragged, or was careless, or let the lozengiers catch him, was not just in danger, but had actually failed at love, had proven himself unworthy of it. Discretion was a virtue on par with courage. The good lover suffered in silence, guarded the lady's honour above his own life, and would sooner die than let her name be spoken, which meant the entire emotional payoff of courtly love was structured around never getting caught, turning the affair into a permanent exercise in high-stakes concealment. To manage all this concealment, lovers used go-betweens, trusted messengers who could carry what the lovers themselves could not risk carrying in person, a confidential servant, a loyal friend, a sympathetic member of the household could ferry a message, a token, or a whispered arrangement between two people who could never be seen exchanging such things directly. The go-between is everywhere in medieval romance, and the role was genuinely delicate because this person now held a secret that could destroy both lovers, which made choosing the right confidant a matter of real consequence. Trust the wrong servant and your discreet, deniable, carefully guarded love was suddenly one bribe or one grudge away from reaching exactly the ears you'd spent months keeping it from. Gifts and tokens formed another whole layer of the code, and they were dangerous precisely because they were physical. Unlike a glance, a ring is evidence. So the exchange of tokens carried real weight. A lady might give her knight a ring, a jewel, a lock of hair, or, most famously, a sleeve or a scarf to carry into battle or a tournament. He might wear her token openly on his arm or his helmet, which in the tournament context was actually permitted, even celebrated, because there it could be read as a formality of the sport rather than a confession. This was one of the rare arenas where a man could publicly display a woman's favour and have it be, officially, deniable. He simply carries a lady's token as knights do, and everyone politely agrees not to ask which lady or why his hand shakes when he ties it on. Colours and clothing spoke too, in a language everyone at court could partly read. Wearing a particular colour could signal a mood or an allegiance. Green was associated with new love and sometimes with faithlessness, blue with fidelity and constancy. A lover might dress to send a message, choosing colours that those in the know would understand while remaining perfectly explicable to everyone else. This was flirtation you could wear, a private message hidden inside a public wardrobe, legible to the one person meant to read it and invisible, or at least deniable, to all the lozengiers watching for a slip. It let you announce your feelings and your faithfulness while never once opening your mouth. Then there was the flower and plant lore, which the later Middle Ages elaborated into something close to a full symbolic language. Particular flowers carried particular meanings. The rose for love, of course, but also more specific vocabularies where different blooms and herbs stood for hope, for fidelity, for rejection, for remembrance. A lover could present a small arrangement, or a single flower, that said something quite precise to a recipient who knew the code, while looking to everyone else like an innocent seasonal courtesy. Handing someone a flower is about the most deniable gesture imaginable, and that was exactly the point. The medieval lover weaponized ordinary garden politeness into a delivery system for messages he could never afford to say aloud. Music and poetry sat at the very centre of all this, and they were the boldest instrument in the kit, because a song could be sung out loud in the hall, in front of everyone, and still be deniable. A troubadour or a knight who could compose could perform a song of love and longing before the whole assembled court, and if the song named no names, if it kept to the conventions of anguished devotion to an unnamed, idealized lady, then it was simply entertainment, simply the fashionable art of the day. But the lady it was really meant for would know. The court would half guess. The delicious tension of a love song performed in public was that everyone present understood it might be aimed at someone in the room, and no one could prove at whom, which turned an evening's music into a spectator sport of watching faces for the flush of recognition. The poets even built the deniability into the form. Troubadour love poetry conventionally addressed the lady by a code name, a senhal, a secret pseudonym used in place of her real name. A poet might address his songs to Belvézère or Bonvézy or some other coined name, so that the entire body of his work could praise and long for a specific real woman, while never once identifying her. The senhal let a poet publish his love, perform it, circulate it, make it famous, while preserving, at least on the surface, the lady's anonymity and honour. It's a wonderfully medieval solution. Not to hide the love, which was half the point of feeling it, but to hide only the one fact that could actually get someone hurt, and to broadcast everything else as loudly as a lute would carry. All of this indirection can look like mere fashion, until you remember what was actually at stake. because the danger was not imaginary. A husband in this period had extensive legal and practical power over his wife, and a wife's adultery was a grave matter touching a family's honour, its bloodline, and the legitimacy of its heirs, which in an aristocratic world meant the inheritance of land and title. A husband who believed himself wronged could respond with real violence, and the law and custom of the time often gave him a wide berth to do so. For the man, pursuing another lord's wife meant risking that lord's fury, and a lord could ruin, imprison, exile, or kill a dependent knight far more easily than the other way around. The elaborate deniability of courtly flirtation was not an aesthetic. It was quite literally a set of survival protocols. The most famous illustration of the whole system is also its most tragic, and it comes not from a manual, but from the greatest love story of the age. The tale of Lancelot and Guinevere, shaped, as we saw, by Chrétien de Troyes writing for Murray de Champagne, is in one sense an extended case study in exactly these mechanics. The greatest knight in the world in love with his king's wife, the affair conducted in glances and secret meetings and coded understandings, the constant menace of the court watchers looking to expose them, and the certainty that discovery means catastrophe. When the affair is finally revealed, it doesn't end in a quiet scandal. It brings down the entire fellowship of the Round Table and destroys Camelot. The story took the everyday anxiety of the medieval lover, that all your careful concealment could collapse in a single unguarded moment, and wrote it as large as it could possibly be written. And yet the ordinary reality, for most of the people playing this game most of the time, was probably less operatic and more like a permanent low-grade tension humming under the surface of aristocratic social life. A tension that made every feast and every dance and every evening of music quietly electric. Two people who could not speak plainly, watched by a hall full of people primed to notice, communicating through where their eyes went, what colours they wore, which flower changed hands, whose song made whom look up too quickly. It was exhausting, and it was thrilling, and it was, above all, a genuine skill, one you could be good or bad at, one the whole culture trained its aristocrats to read and to perform. Learning to flirt at a medieval court was less like learning to be charming, and more like learning a second language, one where a mistake in grammar could cost you your position, your freedom, or your life. Chapter 5. The Rules of Cheating. Yes, there were rules. We've circled this idea for 4 chapters now, so it's time to look straight at the strangest load-bearing beam in the whole structure of courtly love, the sincere, repeatedly stated position that true love could not exist inside marriage, and therefore had to exist outside it. This wasn't a scandalous aside whispered by a few cynics. It was written into the foundational manual by our chaplain Andreas Capellanus, ruled upon in the courts of love by Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter, and sung by the troubadours as a matter of settled principle. And once a whole culture agrees that real love lives outside marriage, it needs something genuinely peculiar to follow, a code of manners for adultery, rules, etiquette, do's and don'ts for the affair. The Middle Ages, with a completely straight face, produced exactly that. To be fair to the medieval mind, the logic that got them here was consistent, even if the destination was absurd. Recall the definition from Chapter 1. Love, in the courtly sense, is freely given, secret, uncertain, and constantly at risk of being lost. Marriage among the aristocracy was none of those things. It was a public arrangement of property and alliance, entered for dynastic reasons, in which the spouses were duty-bound to each other whether they felt anything or not. Run love and marriage through that filter side by side, and they simply fail to match on every single point. The one is chosen and precarious, the other is obligatory and secure. So the conclusion followed with grim tidiness. If love must be freely given and marriage is a duty, then whatever exists between spouses cannot be love, and love must therefore be sought elsewhere. They didn't arrive at adultery through weakness. They reasoned their way there. Andreas builds this into the architecture of De Amor directly. Among his rules of love sits the flat statement that marriage is no proper excuse against loving, meaning the fact that a woman is married is no barrier to a man's legitimate love for her, and may even be the necessary precondition for it. If real love can't happen within marriage, then a married woman is structurally the correct object of a knight's devotion. Her marriage isn't an obstacle to be regretted. It's part of what makes the love real, because it guarantees that whatever she gives freely, since she owes her husband her duty and owes her lover nothing but her heart. It's a system that took the single biggest obstacle to a love affair, the beloved already being someone's wife, and reclassified it as a feature. But, and this is the crucial turn, permitting the love did not mean permitting a free-for-all. Quite the opposite. Precisely because this love was dangerous, secret, and dishonourable if exposed, it came wrapped in more rules than almost any other kind of human relationship. The whole point of the etiquette was to make the affair noble, disciplined, and above all discreet, so that it enriched the lovers rather than destroying them and the families around them. The medieval code of courtly love is not a license to cheat. It's closer to a strict rulebook for cheating with honour, and the number of conditions it imposes is genuinely startling. Rule 1, towering over all the others, was secrecy, which we met in the last chapter, but which becomes even more absolute here. Concealment wasn't merely tactical, it was a moral obligation the lover owed the lady, because her honour, her marriage, her safety, and potentially her life depended on it. A lover who exposed the affair, through carelessness or through boasting, had committed something close to the worst sin in the entire system, worse, in the logic of courtly love, than inconstancy itself. Andreas states plainly that love divulged rarely lasts, and the culture treated a man who couldn't hold his tongue as fundamentally unworthy of love at all. So the first rule of medieval cheating was the same as the first rule of a certain modern film club. You do not talk about it. Ever. To anyone. The second great obligation was fidelity. And here the system does something almost funny, because it demanded within the adulterous relationship exactly the faithfulness it had declared impossible within marriage. A courtly lover was expected to be utterly true to his lady, to love her and her alone, to want no other. The whole ideal rested on singular, focused devotion. Taking a second mistress while serving the first was a betrayal that broke the code, so you arrive at the fully medieval spectacle of a man cheating on his wife with total moral seriousness, bound by a strict duty of faithfulness to his mistress. The love that existed by definition outside marriage nonetheless imported marriage's central promise, and enforced it more strictly than many marriages managed. Third came the entire apparatus of service and worthiness, which structured the affair like a feudal contract. The lover was, in the vocabulary of the poetry, his lady's man, her vassal, in the same way a knight was the vassal of his lord. He owed her service, loyalty, and obedience, and he was expected to earn her love by making himself worthy of it, through brave deeds, through refinement, through patience, through the improvement of his own character. This is the famous ennobling power of love, the claim that loving a worthy lady makes a man better, braver, and more courteous. Adultery in this framework wasn't supposed to be a matter of grabbing what you wanted. It was a long, disciplined apprenticeship in devotion, in which the lover proved himself over months or years, and the lady's favour was the reward for genuine merit, not a thing to be rushed. And that favour was granted, at least in the idealised code, by stages, a slow, formalised progression that reads almost like ascending ranks. The medieval writers actually mapped these steps out. The lover began as a mere hopeful, a suppliant who had not yet spoken. Then, if the lady permitted, he became a suitor allowed to declare himself. Then, if she accepted his service, he was received as a recognised lover, and only at the final stage was full physical favour granted, if it ever was at all. Each stage had to be earned, and a lover was expected to wait, sometimes indefinitely, moving up only as the lady chose to allow. The affair had a promotion ladder. You did not skip rungs, and the lady alone decided when or whether you climbed. Underneath all of it ran the requirement of secrecy's close cousin, the protection of the lady's honour above the lover's own desires, or even his life. The good lover guarded the lady's reputation as his highest duty, would endure any suffering to protect it, and would sooner die than see her shamed. This is why the poetry is so drenched in longing that goes forever unfulfilled, the pining, the sleeplessness, the wasting away we met in the lovesickness chapter. Much courtly love was, by design, love that was never physically consummated at all, kept deliberately in the realm of yearning and service precisely because consummation was so dangerous. The suffering wasn't a bug. For a great many of these relationships, the exquisite, permanent, unresolved ache was the relationship, and a lover who complained about not getting further had misunderstood the assignment. Jealousy, meanwhile, was folded in as a positive requirement rather than a flaw to be managed. which we touched on with Andreas's rules and which lands even harder here. His rule that a person incapable of jealousy is incapable of love makes a certain sense once you remember that the beloved was married to someone else. The lover was, by definition, in permanent competition with a husband who had every legal right to her. Jealousy, in that situation, was simply proof that you cared, evidence that the love was alive and anxious and real. So the code that demanded serene discretion in public also demanded churning jealousy in private, and considered a lover who felt no jealousy to be no lover at all. A man calmly sharing his beloved with her husband and feeling fine about it had, by these lights, no real love in him. Now, how much of this ornate machinery corresponded to anything real? And how much was a beautiful fiction the aristocracy told itself? The honest answer, as with the courts of love, is that we should be cautious. The code, as I've laid it out, comes primarily from literature and from manuals like Andreas's, from poems, romances and treatises that describe an ideal, not from divorce records and court cases that document what people actually did. Real medieval people certainly had affairs, and real medieval husbands certainly reacted to them, often without any of this refined etiquette, and frequently with straightforward violence. The elaborate rule-book of courtly adultery was an aspiration, a game, a shared cultural fantasy about how love ought to work among the refined, not a description of how the average unfaithful spouse actually conducted themselves in the 12th century. That gap between the ideal and the reality is exactly where things get interesting, because the Church, of course, had views, and the two systems were in flat contradiction. Christian teaching was unambiguous. Adultery was a grave sin, one of the commandments broken, a betrayal of a sacrament, a sure road to damnation without repentance. There was no version of church doctrine in which secret adulterous love ennobled anyone, and so the entire glittering culture of courtly love existed in open defiance of the official moral teaching of the age, celebrated at the very same courts whose lords and ladies attended Mass, confessed their sins, funded monasteries, and worried genuinely about their souls. The same aristocrat could patronize a troubadour singing the glory of secret love on one evening, and kneel in confession the next morning, and somehow hold both. That contradiction, of course, is exactly what Andreas himself dramatized when he spent most of his book teaching courtly love, and then devoted his final section to rejecting the whole thing as a sinful snare that offends God and ruins the body. He was living inside the same tension as his entire audience, drawn to the elaborate, thrilling code of noble adultery, and unable to fully square it with the faith that told him it was sin. His book doesn't resolve the contradiction, because the culture didn't resolve it either. It simply held both at once, the sung ideal and the confessed sin, and let them coexist in the same halls, sometimes in the same person, on the same day. There's also a real question about how much of this was ever meant to be acted upon, and how much was pure literary sport, a fashionable pretense that let a court flirt with the idea of transgression, while mostly staying on the safe side of it. Many scholars think courtly love functioned largely as an elevated game of manners, a way for a knight to pay elaborate, structured, semi-public homage to a great lady, often his lord's wife, that both parties and the whole court understood to be a performance of devotion rather than an actual sexual affair. In that reading, the cheating was frequently more theatrical than physical. The trembling verses, the tokens, the years of service, all conducted with an unspoken agreement that it would probably never cross the final line, because crossing it would shatter the very honour the game was built to display, which leaves us with something genuinely strange to sit with as we close this chapter. A whole civilization declared, seriously and repeatedly, that real love lived outside marriage, and then, instead of dissolving into chaos, it responded by building the most elaborate rule-book imaginable around that love. Secrecy as sacred duty, fidelity to the mistress, faithful service earned in stages, honour protected above life, jealousy as proof, and the whole thing shadowed at every step by a church insisting it was mortal sin. The people who decided marriage couldn't contain love did not thereby decide that anything goes. They decided with tremendous care that even betrayal must have its etiquette, and then they wrote it down. Chapter 6. Ask the poem, Love Advice from the Troubadours. We keep brushing up against the troubadours, so tonight they finally get the spotlight, because they are the source of nearly everything we've discussed. Before Andreas Capellanus systematized courtly love into rules, before Eleanor and Marie held their courts, The ideas were already alive and travelling, sung, not written, performed, not filed. The troubadours were the poet-musicians of southern France who, over the 12th and into the 13th century, invented the entire vocabulary of Western romantic love as we still half recognise it. The unattainable beloved, the ennobling suffering, the devotion that improves the soul. They were, in the most literal sense, professional experts in love. Men and a striking number of women who made pining into a craft, a reputation, and in the best cases a living. Start with the word itself because it tells you where this came from. Troubadour derives from the Occitan verb trobar, meaning to find or to invent or to compose. A troubadour was, at root, a finder, someone who found the right words and the right tune, and crucially they wrote and sang not in Latin, the language of the church and the manuals, but in Occitan, the everyday spoken language of southern France, also called the Languedoc. This matters enormously. Love poetry in the vernacular, in the language people actually spoke and flirted in, meant that for the first time this kind of art was aimed squarely at a lay, aristocratic, secular audience rather than at monks and scholars. The people writing the rules of love for once were not the celibate clergy of Chapter 1. They were courtiers, knights, and professional entertainers singing to a hall full of nobles in their own tongue. The traditional first troubadour, the one at the head of the whole tradition, was a genuinely startling character. William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, who lived from 1071 to 1126. He was one of the most powerful lords in France, ruler of a territory larger and richer than the king's own domain. And he was also, by his own cheerful account, a rogue. His surviving songs range from tender early love lyrics to poems of frank, boastful, wildly obscene sexual comedy, the kind of thing you would not expect from the founding father of refined romantic devotion. He was excommunicated more than once, feuded with the church, and generally lived exactly as scandalously as a man of his power could. And here is the detail that ties the whole story into a bow. William IX was the grandfather of Eleanor of Aquitaine. The tradition of courtly love quite literally ran in her blood. She was the granddaughter of the first troubadour, and she carried that culture north into France, and then across the Channel into England. What the troubadours built out of William's foundations was a strikingly consistent philosophy of love, and its central concept has a name, fin amour, usually translated as refined love or perfect love. This was the real thing, the pure and elevated love the whole tradition aspired to, and it came with specific commitments we've now seen from several angles. Fin amour was love directed at a worthy person, usually a lady of high station, often married and usually unattainable. It was love as service and devotion, in which the lover humbled himself before the beloved and sought to become worthy of her. And above all, it was love understood as a force that ennobled and improved the one who felt it. The idea, radical and durable, that longing for the right person could make you a better human being. Strip away 8 centuries and that specific notion that love refines and elevates the lover is still sitting quietly at the centre of how we talk about romance today. The emotional heart of fin amour, though, the mood that saturates the songs, is a particular kind of exquisite suffering the troubadours prized above almost everything, and it has its own vocabulary too. The lover yearns for a lady he cannot have, and the yearning itself, the longing, the ache, the sweet pain of unfulfilled desire, is treated not as a problem to be solved, but as the very substance and proof of true love. This is the joy and the sorrow of the troubadour lyric intertwined, a joy that lives inside pain, a devotion that feeds on the fact that it will probably never be satisfied. The greatest troubadour songs are not celebrations of love returned. They are meditations on love that hurts, love held at a distance, love that improves you precisely because you can never quite reach it. Which means the entire tradition ran on a strange fuel. The more hopeless the love, the better the poetry, and a troubadour who actually got the girl had, in a sense, lost his best material. The single most famous embodiment of this hopeless love ideal is a troubadour named Joffre Rudel, a nobleman of the mid-12th century, and his legend is so perfectly on theme that it sounds invented, though the songs are real. Joffre developed the concept the tradition calls amour de loin, love from afar, love for a distant beloved. According to the story attached to him, he fell deeply in love with the Countess of Tripoli, a woman in the Holy Land whom he'd never seen, based purely on reports of her beauty and virtue, brought back by travellers and pilgrims. He composed his songs of longing for this woman he had never laid eyes on, and eventually he took the cross and sailed to the Levant to find her. The legend ends that he fell ill on the voyage, was carried ashore at Tripoli dying, and expired in the arms of the very countess he had loved from afar, having reached her at last only to die in her embrace. It is almost too neat. A man who made an entire art of loving someone he'd never met, dying at the exact moment of finally meeting her. Whether the biography is history or romance, the songs of distant love are genuine, and Geoffrey remains the patron saint of every person who has ever fallen for someone completely out of reach. Now, an important correction to a picture I may have accidentally painted, because it matters. The troubadours were not all men, and the tradition was not a story of male poets and silent female objects. Southern France produced a body of women troubadours known as the Troberites, female poet-composers of the same courtly world, working in the same forms, and their surviving work is precious partly because it flips the whole perspective. The most celebrated of them is the Comtesse de Dia, known as the Countess of D, whose songs survive with a rare and genuine emotional directness. Where the male troubadours often idealize as distant, unreachable lady, the Troberites write from inside the experience, of desire, of a lover who has grown cold, of frustration, of wanting a man and saying so. The Countess of D writes of her own longing and her own worth with a frankness that cuts straight through the elaborate machinery, and reading her after a stack of male troubadours is like hearing the lady in all those songs finally clear her throat and answer back. The Troberites remind us of something easy to forget under all the poetry. Real women were participants in this culture, not just its subjects, and the men who sang to them ranged widely in station, which is part of what makes the tradition so lively. Some troubadours were great lords like William IX, others were of middling birth, and a good number rose from genuinely humble origins on the strength of their talent alone, which in a rigidly stratified society was close to miraculous. The most admired troubadour of them all, Bernard de Ventadorn, active in the middle of the 12th century, was by tradition the son of a servant, a baker, or a man who tended the castle ovens depending on the source, who rose through sheer poetic gift to sing at the greatest courts in France, and who is connected in the old accounts to the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine herself. His songs are considered among the finest the tradition produced, models of Finnemore at its most tender and musical. A baker's son, singing love songs to a duchess and queen, remembered 800 years later while the names of most of the lords in that hall have vanished entirely. That social mobility points to the practical reality underneath the romance, because troubadours had to eat, and this is where the professional love expert framing becomes literal. Many troubadours depended on patronage, on a wealthy lord or lady who supported them, housed them, and rewarded them for the entertainment and prestige their art brought to the court. A gifted troubadour was a genuine asset, drawing admiration and status to a household, and courts competed for the best of them. There was also a related but lower status figure, the joggler or jongleur, the performer who might sing and play the compositions, sometimes the troubadour's own songs, sometimes travelling and performing for pay. The line between composing and performing, between the artist and the entertainer, could blur, but the essential point stands. Love poetry was, for these people, a career, and the exquisite suffering they sang about with such conviction was also, quite practically, the product they were selling to the court that fed them. Which leads to one of the most delightful and revealing features of the whole tradition, the debate poems, songs built entirely around arguing about love as an intellectual problem. The two main forms were the tenso, a debate poem in which two poets take opposing sides of a question and argue it out in alternating verses, and the partimen or joc partit, a specific variety in which one poet poses a dilemma with two horns and lets the other choose which side to defend, taking the remaining side himself. And the questions they debated are exactly the material of the Courts of Love from Chapter 3. Is it better to love a lady who is higher in rank or one who is equal? Should a lover prefer a woman who grants her favours or one who withholds them? Is a lover who has been unfaithful once worth taking back? The troubadours turned love into a formal subject for structured argument, a topic you could take a position on and defend with wit against an opponent. Love not as feeling, but as debating society, conducted in verse for the entertainment of a hall. All of this, the philosophy, the suffering, the debates, the Troberites answering back, travelled and its spread is the reason we're still talking about it. The culture of the southern troubadours moved north into France proper, where it shaped the poets called trouvères, who worked in the northern language and adapted the same ideals. It moved into Germany, where the Minnesänger, the singers of Minne, meaning courtly love, built their own rich tradition on the same foundations. It fed directly into the great romances, into Chrétien de Troyes and the Arthurian love stories, and downstream into Dante and Petrarch and the entire European lyric tradition that followed. The specific ideas these southern French poet-musicians worked out in Occitan in the 12th century, that love ennobles, that longing has worth, that the beloved deserves devotion and service, became the shared inheritance of Western romance, quietly underwriting love songs still being written today. There's a darker coda that we shouldn't skip, because the golden age of the troubadours in their southern homeland was brought to an end by force, not by fashion. In the early 13th century, the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal military campaign launched against the Cathar heresy that had taken root in southern France, devastated the very region, Occitania, that had nurtured this culture. The courts that had sustained the troubadours were shattered, their lords killed or dispossessed, the whole distinctive civilization of the south broken under a war fought in the name of religious orthodoxy. Many troubadours scattered, seeking patronage in Italy and Spain and elsewhere, carrying their art into exile and helping seed those other traditions. The flowering of Finamore in its birthplace was cut short by crusade, and there is a grim irony in noting that the culture that sang most beautifully of love was ended by a holy war. So when we talk about the bizarre dating advice of the Middle Ages, the troubadours are where a great deal of it was actually composed, not in a manual, but in music, by people who had thought harder about the mechanics of longing than almost anyone before them. They gave us the distant beloved and the ennobling ache, the lover as humble servant, the idea that whom you love shapes who you become. They argued it out in debate poems, they sold it to the courts that housed them, they had it answered back by the Troberits, and they carried it across Europe when their own country was burned out from under them. Every time someone today writes a song about wanting a person they cannot have, and finding themselves somehow improved by the wanting, they are, without knowing it, taking advice from an Occitan poet dead for 800 years who would have understood the feeling exactly. Chapter 7. Beauty standards and the things people did about them. If you were trying to be attractive in the 12th or 13th century, you needed to know what the target actually was, and the good news is that medieval people were remarkably specific about it. Poets, romance writers, and beauty-conscious authorities left detailed descriptions of the ideal face and body, so precise that they amount to a checklist. The bad news is that hitting the checklist involved plucking, painting, and dosing yourself with substances that range from the merely useless to the genuinely poisonous. Medieval beauty was a real and serious pursuit with its own standards, its own products, and its own recipes. And a fair number of those recipes read, to modern eyes, less like a cosmetics routine, and more like a slow method of harming yourself on purpose. Start with the face, because that's where the descriptions concentrate. The ideal medieval beauty, as the poets drew her again and again, was fair-skinned. Pale, smooth, unblemished skin was the single most prized feature associated with nobility, youth, and health. She had blonde or golden hair, which the literature adores above all other colours, bright eyes, often specified as grey or blue, red lips and rosy cheeks set against that pale skin, and a high, smooth, broad forehead. That last one is worth pausing on, because the high forehead was genuinely central to the medieval ideal. A large expanse of clear, pale brow was considered a mark of beauty and refinement, and it drove one of the strangest grooming practices of the age. To get that fashionably high forehead, women plucked. Specifically, they plucked back the hairline at the front and top of the head, removing hair to raise the forehead and create that broad, open expanse the poets praised. And they didn't stop there. The fully fashionable look also involved plucking the eyebrows down to a thin line, or removing them almost entirely, so the ideal face was pale, high-browed, and nearly browless. This is why the women in certain late medieval portraits look slightly startling to us, with their hairlines pushed impossibly far back and barely a suggestion of eyebrow. They weren't losing their hair, they were achieving a look, and the look required tweezing your own scalp line backward inch by painful inch. The pursuit of the noble forehead meant, in practice, deliberately giving yourself a receding hairline. The desire for pale skin drove the cosmetics, and this is where the recipes turn hazardous. To achieve and enhance that prized fairness, medieval and later women used skin whitening preparations, and the most effective whiteners available were based on lead. White lead, a lead compound also used as a pigment in paint, could be ground and applied to the face to produce a smooth, pale, even complexion. And it worked, in the sense that it made the skin look strikingly white. It also happened to be poisonous. Lead absorbed through the skin over time causes a grim catalogue of harm: skin damage, hair loss, and worse with prolonged exposure, so the very product that delivered the fashionable pale face was, with regular use, quietly corroding the person wearing it. The medieval and early modern beauty market's most reliable route to a flawless complexion was, in the long run, a route to ruining it. Lead was not the only alarming ingredient in the medieval and early cosmetic arsenal. Preparations to improve the complexion, remove blemishes, and lighten the skin drew on a range of substances that we would now keep well away from a human face. Mercury compounds turn up in skin treatments, prized for stripping away the top layer of skin to reveal a fresher surface underneath, which is to say, for chemically peeling the face with a heavy metal. Various caustic and abrasive ingredients were used to remove freckles and spots, on the logic that a blemish could simply be burned or scoured off. The general medieval approach to a skin imperfection was often to apply something strong enough to remove it, and strong enough to remove a freckle frequently meant strong enough to damage the skin doing it. Not everything in the beauty cabinet was toxic, in fairness, and some of it was merely strange or unpleasant rather than dangerous. Recipes survive for a whole range of cosmetic aims, drawing on herbs, flowers, animal fats, and assorted kitchen and barnyard materials. There were preparations to lighten the hair to the coveted blonde, using ingredients and long hours sitting in the sun to bleach the hair golden. There were treatments for the skin using ingredients like breadcrumbs, egg whites, and various plant extracts, some of which were harmless and even mildly effective as we would understand them. And there were remedies of a more folkloric character, animal products and unlikely substances pressed into service on the reasoning that they might do something applied with hope more than evidence. The medieval beauty routine mixed the sensible, the useless, and the poisonous more or less indiscriminately, because there was no clear way to tell them apart. One of the richest sources for all of this is a body of texts associated with the name Trotula, connected to the medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, which was one of the great centres of medieval medicine. The Trotula texts include, alongside serious material on women's medicine and health, a substantial section on cosmetics, on the care of the skin, hair, face, teeth, and body, with practical recipes for beautification. This is genuinely significant. It means beauty preparations were treated as a proper subject within the medical and scholarly tradition, written down, organised and transmitted with the same apparatus as remedies for illness. Beautification wasn't dismissed as frivolous vanity beneath the notice of learned men. It sat inside the medical literature, recipes for a smooth complexion filed not far from treatments for real disease, because looking well and being well were understood as related concerns. The Salernitan cosmetic material is also notable for how thorough it is, covering the whole body head to toe. There are recipes and advice for hair, for colouring it, thickening it, making it grow, and removing it where unwanted. The removal of unwanted body hair was a real concern, and depilatory preparations were part of the standard repertoire. There is care for the face and the complexion, for the lips and the teeth and the gums, for the hands and for body odour. There is even attention to intimate care and to appearing youthful. The picture that emerges is of a fully developed beauty culture with a solution, or at least an attempt at one, for essentially every part of the body a person might worry about, a comprehensive regimen, assembled centuries before anything we'd call a beauty industry existed. Teeth deserve their own moment, because dental care was a genuine concern and the methods are a mix of the surprisingly reasonable and the faintly horrifying. Medieval advice recommended cleaning the teeth and keeping them white, and offered preparations to do it. Tooth powders and rubs made from various ingredients meant to scour the teeth clean and whiten them. Some of these were sensibly abrasive, others leaned on ingredients we would find questionable. There was also advice on freshening the breath, using herbs and aromatic substances chewed or rinsed to cover unpleasant odours. The medieval mouth, without anything resembling modern dentistry, was a real battleground, and people fought for a clean white smile and fresh breath with whatever the herbal and mineral world offered, achieving mixed and sometimes gritty results. It would be easy to make all this sound like a purely female preoccupation, but medieval beauty standards and grooming applied to men too, and the ideal knight or courtier was expected to attend to his appearance. Male beauty in the romances is described with real attention. The handsome hero has his own checklist of fair skin, bright eyes, good proportions, and a noble bearing. Fashions in facial hair shifted across the period, with clean-shaven faces prized in some times and places and beards in others, and men groomed accordingly. The courtly ideal we met in earlier chapters, the lover who improves himself to become worthy, extended to the physical. A refined man kept himself clean, well-dressed and well-groomed, because appearance was part of the whole package of courtliness. Vanity, or at least careful self-presentation, was not confined to women. Clothing and adornment carried the beauty standard beyond the body itself, and here the medieval world was intensely, expensively conscious of appearance. What you wore signalled your rank and your wealth in immediate legible terms. The quality of the cloth, the richness of the colour, the cut, the ornament, all announced exactly where you stood. Bright, saturated colours were costly because the dyes were costly, so wearing deep, vivid hues was itself a display of wealth. This mattered so much that many places passed sumptuary laws, regulations attempting to restrict who could wear what, reserving certain fabrics, colours, furs and ornaments for the higher ranks and forbidding them to everyone below. The very existence of laws policing who was allowed to dress beautifully tells you how powerful clothing was as a marker, and how anxious the upper ranks were to keep the markers of status from being borrowed by those beneath them. Underneath the specific practices ran a real tension with the church, the same tension we've seen throughout, because Christian moralists were deeply suspicious of cosmetics and adornment. To paint the face, moralists argued, was to improve on, and therefore criticise God's own creation, to suggest that the face he gave you wasn't good enough, and to falsify your appearance in a way that shaded into deception and pride. Cosmetics were associated in the moral literature with vanity, and with the sin of leading others into temptation, and preachers warned against them accordingly. So the woman applying her lead-white complexion or plucking back her hairline was, once again, doing something the official moral culture of her age condemned, beautifying herself against a chorus of clergy, insisting that true beauty was inward, and that painting, the face, endangered the soul. There's a genuine poignancy under the strangeness of all this. Once you set the lead and the plucking aside and look at what people were actually doing, they were trying to be lovely and to be loved, in a world with no real understanding of chemistry, no way to know that the whitener eating their skin was poison, no scientific test to separate the harmless remedy from the harmful one. They followed the ideals their poets sang, they used the best products their apothecaries and their kitchens could produce, and they took real risks in pursuit of the pale skin and high brow and golden hair the culture told them to want. The gap between their intentions and their methods is enormous. They wanted only to look beautiful, and some of them slowly poisoned themselves getting there. But the wanting itself is entirely familiar, and there is nothing medieval about the wish to be found beautiful by someone. So the dating advice of the age didn't stop at how to speak, how to signal, and how to conduct an affair. It extended right down to the surface of the body, to the specific shade of your skin and the exact height of your hairline and the whiteness of your teeth. The medieval person hoping to be desired knew precisely what the ideal looked like, because the poets had described it in detail, and they reached for whatever the world offered to get there. The tweezers, the sun, the breadcrumbs and egg whites, and too often the lead and mercury that made the face fashionably pale while quietly doing harm underneath. Beauty was worth suffering for then exactly as it has been in every age since, and the medieval version simply suffered with fewer facts about what the suffering was costing. Chapter 8. Getting the church to sign off on it. After all the poetry and the plucking, we arrive at the part where two people actually got married, and this is where the medieval world produces its greatest and most delicious contradiction. On one side stood the church, which had spent centuries building marriage into a holy sacrament, one of the great solemn rites binding a Christian's life to God. On the other side stood the actual law of what made a marriage valid, which by the 12th and 13th centuries had settled into a rule so minimal, so free of ceremony, priest or witness, that people could and did get married entirely by accident. The most sacred bond a person could enter required, in the end, almost nothing at all. And the gap between how serious marriage was supposed to be and how easy it actually was to fall into is one of the strangest and most human things the medieval church ever produced. Here is the rule that governed it all, and it's worth stating plainly because it sounds too simple to be true. What made a marriage was consent. Two people, freely expressing their consent to be married to each other, were married. That was the heart of medieval marriage law as the church came to define it, crystallized largely through the work of the 12th century theologian Peter Lombard and confirmed in church practice thereafter. Not the priest, not the ceremony, not the witnesses, not the family's approval, not the property settlement. The consent itself was the thing that created the marriage. Everything else was desirable, encouraged, and proper, but none of it was strictly necessary for the marriage to be real and binding in the eyes of God and the church court. The lawyers even worked out the precise mechanics of how consent created a marriage, and the distinction they drew is the key to the whole beautiful mess. There were two ways to say it. Words of present consent, I take you as my wife, I take you as my husband, spoken in the present tense, created a valid, binding marriage on the spot, immediately, the moment the words were exchanged. Words of future consent, I will marry you, a promise in the future tense, created a betrothal, a binding engagement, but not yet a marriage. And here came the catch that launched 1,000 court cases. A future promise, I will marry you, followed by sexual intercourse, was treated as converting into a full marriage. The consummation turned the promise into the act. So the tense of your verbs genuinely mattered, and the difference between I will and I do was the difference between an engagement and a wedding. Sit with the consequences of that for a moment because they are extraordinary. It meant that a valid, lifelong, sacramentally binding marriage could be created by two people, alone, with no priest, no church, no witnesses, no ceremony, and no documentation whatsoever. Just the right words in the right tense, exchanged between them. A couple standing in a field, in a tavern, in a bedroom, in a garden, saying, I take you as my husband, and I take you as my wife, were as married as any couple wed by a bishop before a cathedral full of witnesses. These informal unions had a name. They were called clandestine marriages, secret or private marriages made without the public formalities, and they were valid. Illegal, discouraged, punished, frowned upon in every possible way, but valid. Once the words were said, the marriage existed, and the full might of the church could not simply wave it away. You can already see the problem this created, and the medieval church courts saw it too, drowning as they were in exactly the disputes it generated. Because if all it took was words exchanged in private, then proving whether a marriage had or hadn't happened became a nightmare. Imagine the cases. A man and woman who had perhaps exchanged such words in private, and now one of them said they were married, and the other insisted they never were. A woman claiming a man had said, I take you as my wife before they slept together, making them married, the man insisting he'd only ever said I will, or nothing binding at all. There was frequently no witness, no document, nothing but two people's contradictory accounts of what words had been spoken in a private moment, and a church court left to somehow determine the truth of a marriage that may or may not have happened in a bedroom with no one else present. The court records that survive from these disputes are among the richest and most human documents the entire Middle Ages left behind, precisely because they turn on exactly these questions. Real people appear in them, arguing over whether a marriage exists, with witnesses called to report what they overheard, gifts produced as evidence of intent, and the exact phrasing of a proposal picked apart word by word. Someone would testify that they heard the couple exchange promises. Someone else would testify to the opposite. The gift of a ring, a coin, a pledge exchanged between the couple could become evidence that something binding had passed between them. These cases are full of ordinary medieval lives caught in the machinery. Courtships gone wrong, promises disputed, seductions dressed up after the fact as marriages or denied as never having happened. And they show us medieval love not as poets imagined it, but as it actually tangled and broke in real households. The reason the church had backed itself into this corner is genuinely principled, and worth respecting even as we laugh at the chaos. By insisting that consent alone made a marriage, the church was making a real moral stand. that marriage was fundamentally about the free agreement of the two people entering it, not about the wishes of their families. This mattered enormously in a world of arranged marriages because it meant that in principle a couple who genuinely consented to each other could marry validly even against their family's wishes, and conversely that a marriage forced on someone who did not truly consent could be challenged as invalid. The consent doctrine put a real, if limited, weapon in the hands of individuals against the dynastic marriage machine. A young couple in love could, in theory, marry each other with a few private words and present the outraged families with a done deal that even the church could not undo. Naturally, the church did everything it could to discourage people from actually exercising this power in secret, because clandestine marriage caused endless trouble, even as the doctrine permitted it. The proper, encouraged way to marry was public and gradual, and the great instrument for that was the reading of the banns. The banns were public announcements of an intended marriage, proclaimed in church on several occasions before the wedding, declaring that these two people intended to marry and calling on anyone who knew of an impediment, a pre-existing marriage, too close a blood relationship, some other bar, to come forward and declare it. The banns existed to drag marriage out of the shadows and into the public eye, to give the community a chance to object before the fact, rather than untangle a disaster afterward, and to make sure nobody was secretly already married to someone else. That last worry, the pre-existing marriage, was a real and serious one, because in a world of valid secret unions, bigamy was a constant hazard, sometimes innocent and sometimes not. A person might have exchanged binding words with someone years earlier in another town and then gone on to marry another publicly, creating a genuine tangle where the second public celebrated marriage was actually invalid because of a first, secret, half-forgotten one. Someone could exploit this deliberately, making private promises to seduce, then walking away and marrying elsewhere. Or a person could find, to their horror, that the partner they'd married in good faith was already bound to another by words spoken long before. The church courts had to sort these out too, determining which of two competing marriages was the real one, and the answer was often the earlier private one over the later public celebration. The list of impediments that could invalidate a marriage was long and in places wonderfully expansive, especially around the question of who was too closely related to marry. The church forbade marriage within certain degrees of kinship, and for a long stretch of the Middle Ages those forbidden degrees extended remarkably far, out to distant cousins most people wouldn't think of as close relations at all. And the prohibited relationships weren't only by blood. There was affinity, relationship created by marriage, so that your late spouse's relatives became off limits. There was even spiritual kinship created by the sacrament of baptism, so that godparents and their families fell within the forbidden zone. The web of people you legally could not marry was so wide that, in the tightly interconnected world of the medieval nobility, almost any two people of rank could probably find some degree of forbidden relationship between them if they went looking. Which brings us to one of the great open secrets of medieval aristocratic marriage. The trick we glimpsed all the way back with Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose first marriage was dissolved partly on grounds of consanguinity, of being too closely related, a relationship that had been perfectly visible from the start and became useful only when the marriage needed ending. This was the loophole hiding inside all those expansive rules. Because the forbidden degrees were so wide, a great many noble marriages were technically within them from the very beginning. The couple were distant cousins, or connected by some prior marriage, in a way that made the union improper on paper. Everyone knew, and everyone ignored it, right up until one party wanted out. Then suddenly the long-known blood relationship became grounds to have the whole marriage declared invalid, never truly a marriage at all. It was in effect medieval annulment on demand for those who knew where to look, and it turned the church's own strict kinship rules into an escape hatch for the powerful. The whole system, then, ran on a magnificent contradiction that the medieval church never fully resolved and mostly just lived with. Marriage was a holy sacrament, solemn, indissoluble, freighted with the weight of God, and it was also so legally frictionless that people stumbled into it with a sentence, disputed it endlessly in court, married their cousins knowing they might use it later, and made binding vows in taverns and gardens with no one watching. The church wanted marriage to be both things at once, infinitely serious and instantly accessible, a sacred bond and a matter of two people's freely spoken word. It insisted on the sanctity, and it refused to add the requirements that would have protected that sanctity, because to require a priest and witnesses would have meant abandoning the principle that consent alone was enough, and that principle mattered too much to give up. Eventually the contradiction became too much to bear, though the fix came late in our story. In the middle of the 16th century, at the Council of Trent, part of the Catholic Church's great response to the Protestant Reformation, the Church finally closed the loophole, decreeing that for a marriage to be valid it now had to be celebrated before a priest and witnesses. The centuries of valid clandestine marriage, of unions made by private words alone, of couples married by accident in bedrooms and fields, were brought to an end by requiring the very public formality the medieval church had always wanted but never dared to make mandatory. For the whole span of the High and later Middle Ages, though, the strange rule held: 2 people, the right words, and consent freely given, and you were married in the eyes of God, priest or no priest, witnesses or none, whether you'd fully meant to or not. Chapter 9. Charms, Potions, and the Desperate Arts. When persuasion failed and poetry wasn't enough, when the beloved wouldn't look your way, and the etiquette of courtly service was getting you nowhere, the medieval lover had one more option, and it lived well outside the reach of both the poets and the priests. There was magic. A whole underground tradition of love charms, potions, spells, and rituals aimed at one goal: making a specific person desire you, whether they were inclined to or not. This is folk practice rather than courtly refinement, the desperate arts of ordinary people, and we know a surprising amount about it, mostly because the Church spent centuries condemning it in enough detail to tell us exactly what people were doing. The confessors' manuals meant to stamp out love magic ended up preserving the recipes. The single most important source is a strange and revealing genre of church literature called the penitential, and later the confessor's manual, handbooks written to help priests hear confession, listing sins a person might have committed along with the appropriate penance for each. To do their job, these manuals had to describe the sins in question, which means they had to describe, in order to forbid them, the specific practices people were actually engaging in. So the priest was instructed to ask whether the penitent had done particular things to win love, and the particular things named in those questions are our clearest window into what medieval love magic actually looked like. The Church, trying to root out the practice, accidentally became its most careful archivist, and the recipes it preserved are not for the squeamish, because the governing principle of medieval love magic was that you had to get something of yourself into the target, most directly into their food or drink. The idea was that a substance carrying your own essence, consumed by the beloved, would bind their desire to you, which led to some genuinely alarming culinary practices. A woman hoping to secure a man's love might attempt to feed him food or drink that had been in contact with her own body, and the sources describe methods that are exactly as unpleasant as that sounds. The recurring theme is bodily fluids and bodily products, secretly administered in a meal or a cup of wine, on the theory that consuming a piece of you would make him yours. Menstrual blood appears repeatedly in these condemnations, named specifically as an ingredient women were accused of mixing into food or drink to secure a man's affection. Bodily secretions of various kinds turn up alongside it, and one method that recurs across the sources with grim consistency involves food, particularly bread or cake, brought into contact with a woman's body in intimate ways before being fed to the man, dough placed against the skin, or worse, so that it absorbed something of her before baking. The medieval love philter, in its folk practical form, was frequently not an elegant vial of glowing potion, but a piece of bread with a genuinely disturbing preparation history, handed to an unsuspecting man by a woman who wanted him to fall for her over dinner. The logic underneath all this, however alarming the specifics, was coherent within the magical worldview, and it's worth understanding rather than just recoiling from. Medieval magic often ran on the principle we now call sympathetic magic, the idea that things once connected remain connected, and that a part carries the power of the whole. Your hair, your nails, your blood, your bodily fluids were you, magically speaking, and so getting them into another person, or binding them together with something of the target's, could forge a real link between two people. It's the same logic that made hair and fingernail clippings prized ingredients, and that made getting hold of something belonging to the target, a piece of their clothing, their hair, so valuable for a spell. The disgusting recipes weren't random. They followed a consistent, if entirely mistaken, theory of how connection between people could be manufactured. Beyond the ingested potions, there was a whole world of spoken and written charms, spells recited or inscribed to compel love. Words, in the medieval magical understanding, had power, and the right words said over the right object at the right time could bend a person's heart. There were incantations to be spoken, sometimes borrowing the language and forms of Christian prayer, which appalled the church doubly, both for being magic and for perverting sacred words to do it. There were charms written on parchment or other materials, to be carried, hidden, or placed where they would work on the target. Some spells invoked the names of saints, or of God, or of angels. Others reached toward darker powers, invoking demons or spirits to compel the desired person, which shaded love magic toward the truly forbidden territory of demonic invocation. Herbs and plants formed the more respectable, or at least less revolting, end of the tradition, and here folk magic blurred into folk medicine, since the line between a love potion and a herbal remedy was thin. Certain plants had long-standing reputations as aphrodisiacs or as ingredients in love magic, carried down from classical antiquity through medieval herb lore. The mandrake, most famously, with its forked root sometimes resembling a human figure, was surrounded by dense legend and prized for its supposed powers in matters of love and fertility, hedged about with rituals for harvesting it safely. Various other herbs, roots and seeds appear in the love magic tradition, gathered and prepared and administered in the hope of kindling desire. Some had mild real effects on the body, most worked, insofar as they worked at all, entirely through the belief and expectation of the people using them. Timing and ritual mattered as much as ingredients, because love magic, like all magic, was thought to draw power from doing the right thing at the right cosmic moment. Certain days, certain phases of the moon, certain hours were considered more potent for working a charm. Spells might need to be performed a set number of times, or accompanied by specific gestures, or done in secret at a particular place. This ritual dimension is part of why the practice was so hard for the church to stamp out. It was woven into a whole folk understanding of how the world worked, in which the cosmos was full of hidden correspondences, and the skilled practitioner knew how to align with them. The woman baking her charm into bread believed she was working with real forces, following real rules at the proper time, exactly as a physician followed the rules of the humours. Now, who was actually doing all this? The sources point overwhelmingly in one direction, and it's a revealing one. Love magic was strongly associated with women. The confessors' manuals frame these questions largely toward female penitence, and the cultural stereotype of the period increasingly cast women as the practitioners of love charms and potions, the wife trying to secure a straying husband, the woman trying to win a man above her station, the spurned lover seeking to compel a return. This association is important, and a little dark, because it fed directly into something far more dangerous down the line. The image of the woman who uses secret potions and charms to manipulate men, to compel desire and bend the will, was one of the threads that would eventually be woven into the witch stereotype, as the later Middle Ages and early modern period turned suspicion of women's magic into something murderous. That darker trajectory is worth naming clearly, because love magic was not always treated as a harmless folk eccentricity. For much of the earlier medieval period, the Church's official line was actually sceptical. An influential early text held that much of this magic was delusion, that these women only imagined they had such powers, and the appropriate response was penance for the sinful belief rather than punishment for real sorcery. But attitudes hardened over the centuries. As the later Middle Ages gave way to the early modern witch trials, the woman with her potions and charms was recast from a deluded sinner into a genuine agent of the devil, and practices that had once earned a period of penance could, in the worst times and places, help send a woman to her death. The love charm baked into bread sat historically on a road that led somewhere very grim. There were also love magic practices aimed not at kindling desire but at the machinery of sex itself, and these show up in the sources with particular anxiety. Magic was believed capable of causing impotence, of binding a man so that he could not perform, a curse a jealous rival or a spurned woman might lay on a couple to wreck a marriage or a union. This was a genuine and widespread fear, taken seriously enough that the inability to consummate a marriage, if attributed to magic, could become a matter for the church courts, since an unconsummated marriage might be dissolved. So love magic ran in both directions: charms to compel desire and bind two people together, and darker workings to destroy desire and drive them apart, to render a man incapable and a marriage void. The same folk tradition, that promised to win you a lover also threatened to unman your rival. The Church's response to all of this evolved, but its condemnation was consistent, and the reasoning is worth understanding on its own terms. Love magic was sinful for several overlapping reasons in the ecclesiastical view. It attempted to compel another person's will, overriding the free consent that, as we saw last chapter, the Church held to be the very foundation of a legitimate love and marriage. Magic that forced desire was an assault on the freedom that made love real. It frequently involved the perversion of sacred things, twisting prayers and holy names to worldly and lustful ends. And at its worst, it reached toward demons for power, which made it not merely superstition but a form of trafficking with the enemy of God. To the Church, the woman trying to magic a man into loving her was committing a genuine spiritual crime, corrupting the sacred, and possibly consorting with devils all at once. For all the Church's condemnation, though, the practice clearly persisted across the entire medieval period and well beyond, because the impulse behind it was, and is, entirely human. Behind the menstrual blood in the wine and the charm baked into the bread and the muttered incantation at the right phase of the moon stood a person who wanted to be loved by someone who did not love them back, and who could not accept that there was nothing to be done. That is one of the oldest kinds of pain there is, and the medieval world offered, alongside the poet's advice and the priest's counsel, this third path, the desperate one, the forbidden one, the promise that with the right ingredients and the right words you could reach into another person's heart and make them want you. It never worked, of course, but you can understand with real sympathy why someone kneeling in the dark and mixing something dreadful into a loaf of bread would want so badly to believe that it might. Chapter 10, When It All Fell Apart. We've spent 9 chapters watching medieval people fall in love. The rules, the lovesickness, the courts, the secret signals, the potions. So it's only fair to end where a great many of these stories actually ended, which was badly. Love goes wrong in every century, and the Middle Ages left behind a rich, surprisingly modern literature of romance collapsing. The betrayals, the abandonments, the marriages that curdled, and the moralists lining up to say they'd warned everyone. Tonight we look at the fallout, and at the harder question hiding under this whole series: how much of the beautiful advice we've explored did anyone actually follow, and how much was a lovely story the Middle Ages told itself? Start with the greatest medieval love story of them all, because it is, from beginning to end, a catastrophe. The tale of Tristan and Isolde, one of the most popular and widely retold stories of the entire period, spun into countless versions across Europe, is about a knight and a princess who fall helplessly, ruinously in love, and it destroys nearly everyone it touches. Tristan is sent to escort Isolde to marry his own uncle, King Mark of Cornwall. On the voyage, the two of them accidentally drink a love potion meant for Isolde and her husband-to-be, and are bound by an overwhelming passion they cannot escape. What follows is not romance in any comfortable sense. It is an affair conducted in secret against the king, discovery and disgrace, exile, deception, anguish, and finally death. The lovers undone by the very passion that defined them. The detail worth pausing on is that potion, because it tells you something about how medieval people understood love gone wrong. Tristan and Isolde don't choose their love. They're compelled into it by magic, exactly the kind of love compulsion we met in the last chapter, and the story treats this as tragedy rather than triumph. Their passion is real and total, but it is also an affliction, something that seizes them against their will and drives them to ruin, closer to a curse than a blessing. The greatest love story of the Middle Ages is, at its core, about love as a force that takes over two people and wrecks their lives, and the medieval audiences who loved it understood perfectly well that overwhelming passion and total disaster could be the same thing wearing different faces. Even the shining ideal of Lancelot and Guinevere, which we met back in chapter 4, is a story about love destroying a world. In the great cycles of Arthurian romance, the affair between the greatest knight of the Round Table and his king's wife is genuine, deep, and in the courtly sense noble, and it is also the crack that brings down Camelot. When the affair is finally exposed, it splits the fellowship, turns knight against knight, drags Arthur into war against Lancelot, and leaves the kingdom fatally weakened for its final catastrophe. The most celebrated courtly love in medieval literature does not end in happiness. It ends with the destruction of the most famous kingdom the medieval imagination ever built. The lesson embedded in the story is unmistakable and rather bleak. even the noblest love pursued outside marriage carries the seeds of ruin. Real medieval marriages fell apart too, of course, and here we have to be careful with a word, because medieval Christianity did not permit divorce in our sense. Marriage, as we saw, was a sacrament, and a valid sacramental marriage was held to be indissoluble until death, and that was that. What the Church offered instead was annulment, which is a fundamentally different thing. Not the ending of a valid marriage, but a declaration that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place. If you could prove that some impediment had been present from the start, that the couple were too closely related, that one party had been already married, that consent had been given under force, that the marriage had never been consummated where that mattered, then the Church could rule that there had been no true marriage at all, freeing both parties. You didn't end a medieval marriage, you proved it had never really begun. This is the loophole we watched Eleanor of Aquitaine walk through in Chapter 3, and it was the standard escape route for those with the knowledge and resources to use it, since the forbidden degrees of kinship were so wide, and since aristocratic families were so interconnected. A great many marriages were technically flawed from the beginning, sitting quietly within the prohibited degrees, ignored for as long as the marriage was wanted. When a powerful couple wished to part, because the alliance had lost its value, because there was no male heir, because a better match had appeared, the lawyers could often be set to work discovering the convenient blood relationship that had been there all along. Annulment on grounds of consanguinity became, in practice, the divorce of the powerful, a way out dressed up as a legal discovery about a relationship everyone had always known about. For ordinary people without royal lawyers, a broken marriage was a harder and grimmer thing. The church courts could grant a separation, a legal parting of bed and board, allowing an unhappy or abused couple to live apart. But crucially, this did not dissolve the marriage or permit remarriage. The couple remained married in the eyes of God, simply living separately. Grounds might include cruelty or adultery, and the surviving court records show real people seeking these separations, often women trying to escape violent husbands, laying out their suffering before the court in the hope of legal permission simply to stop living with the person they'd married. There was no clean exit for them, no starting over, only at best official permission to live apart while remaining permanently, sacramentally bound to a marriage that had failed. The betrayals that ended courtships and marriages fill the records too, and they are strikingly recognisable across the centuries. The church court documents we met last chapter, the ones full of disputed marriages, are also full of disputed promises. Men who had promised marriage to secure a woman's consent to sex and then vanished. Women left pregnant and unwed by a man who denied ever having pledged himself. Couples whose private vows one party now conveniently forgot. Breach of promise. Seduction under false pretenses. Abandonment. The ugly underside of a system where a marriage could be made by private words was that private words were so easily denied, and the person with less power, usually the woman, was so often the one left ruined when the words were disavowed. Behind the poetry of freely given love lay a great many people who had given freely and been cheated for it. The moralists naturally had been predicting all of this the entire time, and the medieval period produced a whole tradition of anti-love and anti-marriage writing that pushed hard against the romantic ideals we've been exploring. There was a substantial body of literature, much of it clerical, warning men against the miseries of women, marriage and desire, cataloguing the deceptions of women, the torments of jealousy, the loss of freedom and money and peace that love brought, and urging the wise man to avoid the whole snare. This misogynistic tradition was old, drawing on classical and patristic sources, and it ran as a constant sour counterpoint beneath the sweet music of courtly love. For every troubadour singing that love ennobles the soul, there was a cleric writing that women were a trap and desire a road to ruin, and both voices belonged to the same culture. The two traditions could even live inside the same author, which brings us back to where we started, because Andreas Capellanus is the perfect example. His book teaches courtly love for two parts, and then, in its third, turns savagely against it, rejecting women and love in exactly the terms of the anti-love moralists. Chaucer, writing at the end of the 14th century, plays this tension for all its richness. He gives us the soaring tragedy of Troilus and Cresside, a courtly love affair rendered with real tenderness that nonetheless ends in Cresside's betrayal of Troilus and his death, and he gives us the wife of Bath, a woman who has buried 5 husbands and cheerfully demolishes the clerical anti-marriage tradition from her own lived experience. Medieval writers knew love was glorious and knew it was a disaster, and the best of them refused to pretend it was only ever one or the other. Which leads us, at the end of this whole journey, to the question that has been shadowing every chapter. Did people actually live by any of this elaborate advice? Or was it mostly a beautiful fiction? The honest answer, drawn from everything historians have pieced together, is that we should hold the fantasy and the reality apart. The grand system of courtly love, the rules, the courts, the ennobling suffering, the etiquette of noble adultery, was overwhelmingly a literary and aristocratic ideal, a game and an art form enjoyed by a small, wealthy, cultivated elite, and a fantasy even for many of them. It was aspiration and entertainment far more than it was instruction anyone followed step by step. Ordinary medieval people, the vast majority, married for reasons closer to the ground: family, land, labour, survival, and sometimes genuine affection, without a troubadour or a court of love anywhere in sight. And yet it would be wrong to dismiss it all as mere fantasy with no purchase on real life, because ideas shape how people feel even when they don't dictate what people do. The courtly ideal changed the vocabulary of love, gave people new ways to understand and express longing, and set expectations that echoed far beyond the few halls where the game was actually played. The lovesickness the physicians treated was felt by real people in real pain. The marriages made and broken in the church courts were real. The women mixing charms in the dark were real. The advice may have been bizarre, and the grand system may have been half fiction, but the underlying thing it was all reaching toward, the desire to love and be loved, to be found worthy, to not be alone, was as real for them as it is for anyone watching tonight. That, in the end, is what makes these strange people so easy to sit with. Across 800 years and a vast gulf of belief and circumstance, medieval people wanted almost exactly what we want. They wanted someone to look at them across a crowded room. They wanted to be chosen freely rather than out of obligation. They agonized over how to signal interest, feared rejection, suffered heartbreak they thought might kill them, sought advice from experts who often had no idea what they were talking about, and occasionally did something desperate and ill-advised in the name of winning someone's heart. Their methods were their own: the plucked hairlines, the coded flowers, the potions, the courts of love. But the longing underneath was entirely ours. So that's the strange, tender, faintly ridiculous world of medieval love. Rules written by celibate priests, heartbreak treated as a disease, noble women judging affairs of the heart, secret signals and coded songs, the etiquette of cheating, poisonous cosmetics, marriages made with a sentence, love baked into bread, and stories that ended as often as not in beautiful disaster. 8 centuries later, we're still doing most of the same things, just with better lighting and worse poetry, and I find something genuinely comforting in that, in knowing that the same clumsy, hopeful, ridiculous business of trying to love another person has been going on for as long as there have been people to try it. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, and for wandering through all of this at whatever quiet hour you're watching. If you enjoyed the journey, a like or a subscribe helps more than you'd think, only if you mean it. Sleep well, be kind to yourself, and I'll see you next time here on the Somnorian. Good night.